Ready when you are, Larry.
Okay. Thank you to Hannah Colquitt at the National Society of High School Scholars, and also my colleagues Hannah Bowser and Pia Fleming at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, for sponsoring this talk. And many thanks to all of you students who have tuned in. I hope that you find this informative as well as entertaining. I would call your attention to the website of the Foundation for Economic Education. It is fee.org, and it has a terrific search engine and about 70 years of archived material. If the topic of this lecture tonight intrigues you and you'd like to learn more, a very good way to do so is to type in some keywords into that search engine at fee.org, and you'll find many articles that illuminate this subject more fully. When I'm asked, as I frequently am when I'm lecturing before audiences, what I think the most influential thing or person or movement or institution is in the course of history, people often expect me to give names of people or organizations or countries or institutions of some kind. But my response is always a single word, and that is ideas. Ideas, as the great French author Victor Hugo famously said, determine the course of history. They are more powerful than all the armies of the world. Nothing is as powerful, he said, as an idea whose time has come. And certainly the story I want to share with you tonight is testimony to that. It's testimony to how conventional ideas that had pretty much run the world for centuries were upended by some very active and committed, passionate people who changed the world in the process. And the institution that the ideas that I'll be talking about was focused on was the institution of slavery. And one of the most remarkable things in history is how rapidly this widely accepted and long practiced institution came to a virtual end in a space of about 100 years. Late in the 18th century, and as late as the 1780s and 90s, slavery was very common throughout the world and had been for centuries. Many peoples had exercised power over others and used that power in a very heinous and disgusting way in actual slavery, in claiming ownership over other men and women. That institution was not widely questioned in the world as late as the 1780s. It was sort of accepted in much of the world as, hey, you know, we've always had it. Some people are simply destined or meant to live at the end of a whip wielded by others. That was a widely accepted view that, of course, today is certainly not. But the rapidity, the speed with which those ideas changed is really at the core of this remarkable story. And it really is the story, more than anything else, of three people in particular, two of which I'll dwell on at some length. And I don't want to say that to suggest that they were the only three people. There were many, many people involved in the movement to end the institution of slavery, but it really started in Great Britain at the hands of three particular people whose roles were indispensable in ending slavery. Now, probably needless to say, you know this from your study of history, slavery was a cruel and inhumane institution. But many people who practiced it were making money off of it. And some of them were members of legislative bodies like the British Parliament. Again, although I'm going to focus on Great Britain, don't forget that slavery was widely practiced all over the world. And even British slavery involved the collaboration of a number of countries and communities of people in Africa. The British typically didn't venture deep into Africa to round up slaves and then take them to the coast and onto their boats. They typically made arrangements ahead of time with African natives who would go kidnap fellow Africans and sell them to the British. So there was money to be made from by various people, not just slave holders in Britain or British possessions in the Caribbean, but also even within Africa. There was an incident on the high seas in 1781 or 82, I've forgotten which year it was, that really is the starting point for our story. The incident involved a British slave ship called the Zong, Z-O-N-G. And the Zong, as was the case with many British slave vessels, left a British port. I don't recall, either Bristol or Portsmouth was most likely, and then traveled to Africa. And usually a slave ship could get all the 4 or 5, maybe even 600 slaves they wanted to transport across the Atlantic to Caribbean colonies. They could get them in maybe 3 or 4 stops along the African coast. But the Zong had an especially long voyage. She had to make many stops for a variety of reasons before she filled her hold with enough slaves to make the trip at least presumably or tentatively worthwhile. And that's significant because it meant that the slaves who were captured early were on the ship the longest for this very trying experience of travel across the Atlantic. It was called the Middle Passage, and it was fraught with disease and malnutrition and seasickness and cruel treatment at the hands of those who had enslaved the Africans on board. And so by the time the Zong approached its intended destination in the Caribbean, Jamaica, as I recall, the slaves that had been on the boat the longest were in the worst shape. They were the most malnourished, mistreated. They were the ones who were near death in many cases. And the slave ship captain surveyed his, as he called them, his cargo, and had to think about, what am I going to do? If I go to port in Jamaica and go to a slave auction, I'm not going to get very much for these slaves that are in such terrible condition. So he made a cold calculation. He decided that he could get more money if he somehow got rid of the worst of the cases, the most malnourished and near death. If he could get rid of them and put in an insurance claim, he could get more money from that than if he proceeded to port and to sell the slaves at auction. So he gave the order to throw overboard 122 living souls. Now, we are aghast today at that thought, but it was not all that uncommon in those days. But on the Zong were crew members who had a conscience. And when the vessel reached its home port back in Britain, some of those crew members began to talk. Their consciences were pricked by what they saw, and they couldn't bear it. So they began to talk. And word of what happened on the Zong got to a man named Granville Sharp. He was in his later years at that point, but he'd always been among the few in Britain who had spoken out against slavery. And that's remarkable in itself, because slavery within Britain was pretty much gone after 1770 because of a court decision. The slavery that the Britons engaged in was really now confined, although on a massive scale, to colonies in the Caribbean. And because it was so distant, a lot of British people never saw a plantation, never saw a slave, never saw treatment of a slave. And so they were vulnerable to pro-slavery people who would say, oh, we do a good job at this, and the slaves live good lives in the Caribbean. They were selling that kind of myth. And so a lot of British people didn't think much of it. But when Granville Sharp heard of what had happened on the Zong, he decided to press murder charges against the slave ship captain. He wanted publicity for this awful institution that he knew some fellow Britons were engaged in. And so the case went to trial and got a lot of public attention in Great Britain, especially when the judge ultimately threw the case out. And as he did that, he said that this was no big deal. This is not a murder case. This is just a civil dispute, he said, between a slave ship captain and an insurance company. This isn't a case of murder at all. Threw the case out. So that meant the captain and those who participated in this awful crime would not be prosecuted. Well, people with a conscience in Great Britain found this very hard to swallow. And another such person, aside from Granville Sharp, was a professor at Cambridge University, very prestigious British university to this day. And every year at Cambridge, there would be an essay contest that students could enter. It was it had a coveted prize. I forget how much it was, but it was a considerable sum of money. And students had to submit their essays on an assigned topic, and they had to do so in Latin. They had to write the entire essay in Latin. Well, there was a professor in charge of picking the topic, and that year, because he was so affected by the case of the Zong, he decided that the question the students would have to write about would be, is it right for one man to own another? Is it right for one man to own another? Any student could enter, no matter what their major may be at the university. And one such student, Thomas Clarkson, decided to enter the contest. Now, he was planning to be an Anglican minister. He was going to devote his life to that of a preacher in the Anglican Church. You'll see in a moment that he set all that aside for a single important cause. Thomas Clarkson decides to enter the contest, and he's a particularly diligent student. He's not the kind of student who would just write something off the top of his head and turn it in. He wanted to do as much original research as he could, to uncover as much new information as possible, and then come to a conclusion and argue for it in his essay. So he went to Bristol, he went to Portsmouth. These were port cities in Britain where slave vessels left from. He wanted to try to find crew members who would talk so he could learn firsthand as much as he could about what the transatlantic slave trade was all about. And some did talk to him, and he ended up writing an essay. You can read it to this day online, free of charge. Became a very important piece of ammunition in the battle to end slavery. Clarkson, in his essay, explained what he learned in passionate language, and he argued strenuously that this institution of slavery, the slave trade in particular, was a blot on the British nation, that this had to end. It was inhumane, cruel, unjust, and had to go. That was his argument. And he made it so well in his essay that he won first prize. And then a remarkable thing happened. This is written about in a couple biographies of him, including one of, about a dozen years ago called Bury the Chains by Adam Hochschild, Bury the Chains. Anyway, what happened was Clarkson wins the essay contest, and he's on horseback, having left Cambridge, going back to his home in the little town of Wisbech in England. And he's thinking about what he learned and what he wrote about in this essay contest, and it troubles his conscience immensely. And in his diary, he records what happened partway on his journey back to Wisbech. He finally just couldn't take it any longer. He got off of his horse and fell to his knees. And at that moment, he said later in his diary, he said, at that moment, I thought to myself, if what I have written is true, someone must see these calamities to an end. And of course, he wouldn't have known it at that point. But what happens is he devotes the rest of his life, 61 more years, to first ending the trade in slaves, and then going for the full measure, ending slavery itself. And it'll take a long time, but he will work until that's accomplished. And then he lives for another 13 years, dies at the age of 86. And in his last 13 years, as an elderly man, he devotes every ounce of his remaining strength to improving the condition of those he helped to finally liberate from slavery. But think back to the early 1780s. This young man, Thomas Clarkson, he's just a student. How's he going to change national policy in Great Britain? How's he going to change the conscience of the British people? That's his undertaking. If he's going to end slavery, he has to educate people. He has to convince them of what it's really like and why it's wrong. And that's a pretty tall order for anybody in the 1780s, taking on an established institution practiced the world over for centuries and very rarely even questioned. So he looks around and he's trying to find, who can help me in this cause? Who can I enlist to start beating the drums, to spread the message of why slavery is evil and should be abolished? And he looks around and he finds Quakers. The Quakers were really about the only people in Great Britain at the time who had a reputation of speaking out against slavery. But they were sort of written off by most of British society as sort of odd. They had strange beliefs. They lived in strange and Spartan ways. And the Quaker men, for example, had a very annoying habit, or a habit that was annoying to most other Brits, and that is they refused to take off their hats in the presence of nobility if they could get away with it, just as a matter of principle. They thought it offended an even higher authority, which to them was God. But they had been outspoken against slavery. So Clarkson finds as many of these Quakers as he can to help him. And it's in May of 1787 that he and 11 other Quakers, I should say 11 Quakers, not other Quakers, because Clarkson himself was not a Quaker, he was an Anglican. But he and 11 Quakers sitting around a table in a print shop in downtown London, they created the world's first think tank at that moment, May of 1787. It was a single issue think tank called the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And it would focus on that one issue, getting rid of the trade in slaves, and hopefully going beyond that to liberate all those who had already been enslaved. So this is a tall order for a young man and 11 Quakers to undertake, but they start publishing. They take Clarkson's award-winning essay and translate it from the Latin back to English and publish it, distribute it. That's the first of many publications, short and long, that they will issue over the years, trying to convince people about the evils of slavery. In fact, for the next 20 years, this young man, Thomas Clarkson, who will put aside his planned career of being a preacher, devotes all of his time to this one cause. He will travel in the next 20 years, 1787 until 1807, 35,000 miles on horseback all around Great Britain, 35,000 miles on horseback. And what's he doing? He's rustling up signatures on petitions. He wants to take to Parliament to get them to ban the slave trade. He's giving lectures and sermons. He's taking testimony. He's encouraging others to join the cause in one way or another. He's becomes quite a missionary. In fact, a famous British poet, Coleridge, I think it was, referred to Clarkson as a one-man moral steam engine. He just wouldn't quit, no matter what the odds were or seemed to be for success. And of course, in the first few years, because this message is new to most people, they get a lot of converts. One of them is a young member of Parliament named William Wilberforce. Wilberforce actually often gets more credit in the history books than Clarkson does for bringing slavery within the British Empire to an end. But Wilberforce himself acknowledged Clarkson's role and said, he's my right-hand man. I couldn't have done it without him. Clarkson was the one gathering the evidence and the testimony and the signatures on the petitions, and all that he passed on to Wilberforce, who used them in Parliament. And every year, Wilberforce would introduce the bill to end the trade in slaves. And every year it would go down to defeat. Wilberforce, by the way, was influenced by another man who was a major figure in this whole thing. I think I started by saying there were three key individuals at the start of this movement. The third one, aside from Clarkson and Wilberforce, was Wilberforce's pastor, a man named John Newton. John Newton, by 1787, is a very old man, but he had been in his earlier days a slave ship captain. And by his own admission, one of the more cruel ones, one of the more profane ones. He was involved in throwing living people off of slave ships when he thought that was necessary to make more money. So he had some terrible crimes to his name, but as he later told the story, there was a terrible storm one night on the Atlantic, and his crew was desperate, thinking that the ship was going to go down and everybody would die. And some of the men on the ship began to pray. And John Newton was not a man of faith. He was not a Christian, but he joined in anyway. And he made a promise to God. He said, God, if you deliver us from this terrible storm, I will mend my ways and stop this dirty business of the slave trade. The storm came to an end. And John Newton meant what he said. He ended up becoming one of the more dramatic crusaders against slavery. I mean, how more dramatic could you be as an anti-slavery crusader than a former slave ship captain? He will go on to be a minister and to write perhaps the most famous hymn in Christianity. And that is, of course, Amazing Grace. I mean, how many people who have ever gone to church have not sung that hymn, Amazing Grace, written by a former slave ship captain? And when you think of the words, you'll realize that it was very autobiographical. Newton was talking about himself when he wrote in the hymn, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. Well, he exerted a great influence on William Wilberforce. When Wilberforce was trying to decide, should I join this cause? Should I be the guy that introduces the bill that Thomas Clarkson and others want me to introduce? And I'll be ridiculed for it. It may not go anywhere. My parliamentary career might be damaged. He was thinking about all this, and he went back to see John Newton, his old pastor. And Newton told him, this is what you're destined to do. Muster the courage, do the right thing, introduce the bill, stick by it, speak for it until it passes. And so Wilberforce introduced that bill every year using the ammunition, the intellectual ammunition that Clarkson and the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade provided. They worked like busy beavers. And in the first few years, the bill got more and more votes each year, though it went down to defeat. The anti-slavery people got very ingenious at creating this mass movement, you might say. It probably was the very first mass movement in Great Britain that had parliamentary consequences. Certainly the first big one in the late 18th century. For instance, at one point, they felt like, we have to make this visual somehow to the British people so they can see, at least in their minds, something of this evil institution of slavery. So Clarkson went to see Josiah Wedgwood. I bet many of you students have mothers who have Wedgwood china in their closets, because it was very famous in its day. Josiah Wedgwood, the entrepreneur who founded that company, was known to be an opponent of slavery, but he really didn't become active until Thomas Clarkson paid him a visit. And he said to Mr. Wedgwood, can you devise some kind of image that depicts our cause that we can put around plates or, I don't think they had T-shirts back then, but if they did, they would have put it on T-shirts as well. They put it on stationery, on a lot of things. In fact, I have a sample right here that shows this famous image. And you can see it depicts a kneeling black man, his hands in prayer and in chains, and he's looking skyward. And you may not be able to read what's around the perimeter here, but it says, "Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a man and a brother?" The idea of this here was to get people thinking, wow, we're doing this, or some people are doing this awful thing to other human beings. Shouldn't we speak out against it? That's what the anti-slavery people had hoped to accomplish. And that image helped them to accomplish that. You may have also seen in your history books sketches of what the cargo hold of a slave ship typically looked like. There's a very famous one. It's in many history books that you see the outline of a ship, and you see, if you look close, a lot of black figures, and you look closer and you realize each one is a human being, one chained to the next. And Thomas Clarkson himself designed that because he wanted people to realize this is what we're doing. We're kidnapping these people and we're stuffing them in our slave ships and packing them like sardines in the hold of these ships, subject to all kinds of malnutrition and disease on a long trip to the Caribbean. That was another part of the effort to make this visual so the British people could grasp something of just how awful slavery was. Again, remember, preachers, teachers, intellectuals, lots of people for centuries had either ignored slavery or spoke favorably of it. So this is earth-shattering. This is mind-blowing to the British people to learn what this is really all about. And in the early 1790s, with the anti-slavery movement gathering steam, doing better each year in Parliament, something happens to temporarily set the whole thing back. Britain goes to war with France. It's the time of the French Revolution. France is eager to spread its revolutionary message across Europe, and they stir up all kinds of trouble, and the result is war with the rest of Europe and Britain. And when that happens, then you have the pro-slavery people in Parliament. Some of them are actually have personal vested interests, business interests in slavery. They don't want to see it abolished because they're making money off of it. But they begin to use the war as a reason to accuse the anti-slavery people of treason. They say, look at these people like Wilberforce and Clarkson and John Newton raising a fuss against slavery. If we did what they want us to do and abolish slavery within the British Empire, that would simply hand this business over to the French. They would be happy to do it at our expense. So they're traitors. And for a time, the anti-slavery votes in Parliament will decline. And you might think at that point, being accused of traitors, their lives threatened, denounced all the time, prospects for victory looking so dim, that the anti-slavery people might just throw up their hands and say, well, we gave it a good try. Let's go back to whatever it is we were doing before this. But they didn't. And that's one of the most remarkable things. They continued to fight this because, people of character, I think, just don't give up on what they know to be right. And it doesn't matter to people of character what the odds for success may seem to be. They're going to work for what they know to be right no matter what. And that's what the anti-slavery people did. And lo and behold, late in the 1790s, the numbers in Parliament start going up again. There's a great movie that is very accurate to history that if you haven't seen, I strongly recommend because it tells this whole story. It's called Amazing Grace, just like the hymn that I mentioned that John Newton wrote. That's the name of the movie. It came out in 2005, I believe. It stars Ian Griffith, an actor whose image you'll recognize. He's been in a lot of things, and some other big names too. Well, in that movie, the very great moment finally happens and is depicted so well in that movie. It happens at 4 a.m. in February of 1807, almost 20 years since Clarkson and those 11 Quakers sat around a table committing themselves to the success of this cause. At 4 a.m. in February of 1807, Parliament voted yet again on the Wilberforce bill to end the trade in slaves, but this time it passed. I still get goosebumps when I think of it. I mean, it is one of the greatest moments in the history of liberty, in the history of humanitarianism. What a tribute to these endless and tireless efforts of this movement that literally changed the conscience of a nation in 20 years and changed national policy. At that moment, what Parliament did was it said no more trade in slaves. No British vessel could ever go to Africa and kidnap people or be a party to the kidnapping of them and take them as slaves against their will anywhere. That's illegal. But it didn't end the slavery of those already enslaved. That would be the next step. And perhaps you could excuse Clarkson and Wilberforce and the others if they had said after 20 years, let's let somebody else work on that. We've done enough. But they didn't. They immediately knew what the next step would be. Now that they've gotten rid of the trade in slaves, they had to get Parliament to free all the people that had been enslaved and were still living all across the British Empire. Guess how many more years it will take for them to achieve that? I mean, keep in mind, it took 20 to get to where they could abolish the trade in slaves. It will take 26 more years for slavery itself to be ended throughout the British Empire. And that great day came in 1833. Wilberforce was an old man at that point. Clarkson was getting up there, he was in his 70s. And on that great day in 1833, Parliament took the final measure and liberated all those within the British Empire who were still enslaved. And it said, in fact, it set a timetable in 1 year, they would all be free. So there was a year to go. But in his book, Bury the Chains, Adam Hochschild reports that when word got to the British colonies in the Caribbean, the slave colonies, when word got to the slaves there that Parliament had passed this bill, and within a year, they would be free people. Needless to say, there was immense excitement and great emotion. On the night before the law took effect in 1834, Hochschild reports that on many of those Caribbean islands, slaves went to the highest point because they wanted to be there when the sun came up the next morning, because they knew that the sun coming up on a new day meant a new future for them, a future of freedom. And no matter how trying and challenging that might be, that's something they had longed for, and it was finally here. Well, William Wilberforce died 3 days after that vote in Parliament. He lived long enough to see it. And he's memorialized by a wonderful poem and inscription at his gravesite in Westminster Abbey in London. Thomas Clarkson lived another 13 years. And as I mentioned early in this talk, he doesn't quit. And now, until his dying day, he devotes his time, his energies, and his resources to improving the conditions of those who had just been freed. He formed associations to raise money to help them out, to help them with the transition to freedom. What a remarkable thing to have done after devoting his entire life since his days as a student to this single cause. When he died at the age of 86 in 1846, a remarkable thing happened at his funeral in London. Now remember, 61 years before, he was unknown and he would become better known, but in his early years in this movement, he'll become widely attacked, ridiculed. He'll almost lose his life at the hands of an unruly pro-slavery mob in Portsmouth. He put everything on the line for this. And here he is now, dead at 86. And London turns out one of the biggest funerals in the history of the nation, because the British people's conscience, their ideas had so dramatically changed, and they knew that this man was at the core of it. They wanted to honor him. And Hochschild reports in his book that at the funeral, Quaker men, Clarkson was the last of the people from around that print shop table in 1787 who was still around in 1846. But Quaker men who were the sons and the grandsons and other relatives, or just friends of the Quakers who had been so tireless in their efforts to help Clarkson. Quaker men turned out for the funeral, and they did something they almost never did. They took off their hats, because to them, this man was truly a remarkable humanitarian. He changed the conscience and the policy of a great nation. And Great Britain, which a few generations before had been the largest slave trading power in the world, now becomes the greatest, most crusading anti-slave power in the world. The British Navy will be employed to stop what's left of the slave trade and to even blow up from the sea by cannon the fortresses that held slaves at African ports for delivery to slave vessels. I mean, it's a remarkable turnaround for a nation, and something the Brits should be very, very proud of. Now, of course, that ended slavery within the British Empire, but you still had the rest of the world. And slavery will be ended over the next 100 years officially in just about every place. I don't want to leave you with the impression that it doesn't exist. In fact, there's still a lot of it, but it's really undercover. It doesn't enjoy the sanction, the approval, or the active participation and subsidy of any government in the world, to my knowledge, but it's still happening. People being kidnapped and sold into slavery for various reasons. But virtually every country within 100 years, including the United States as a result of a war, will end slavery. And that is a remarkable tribute to the power of ideas, that something as so common, so universally accepted or unquestioned for so long would come to such an end in such a short period of time. And when you look back and ask yourself, how could that happen? What changed? You have to pay tribute to the people who focused on ideas, like John Newton and Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce, who courageously stood for what they knew to be right, educated people about the problem, and brought it to an end. It's a story we should never forget, simply because it tells everybody that ideas are incredibly powerful. If you want to change the world for the better, change ideas for the better. Get people to understand things better. Get them to think of things like personal character in a stronger way. That's another factor that tends to unite the anti-slavery forces, Clarkson, Newton, Wilberforce, and the many others. I didn't mention any women, but there were many. I have an article at fee.org on female British abolitionists. They were considerable in number and growing throughout all these years. In fact, you have to hand it to British women. They're the ones who came up with the idea of boycotting sugar. They started and spearheaded the effort to get people not to buy or to use sugar, because they felt that in every cube of sugar or every tablespoon of sugar, there was a drop of slave blood, because it was slaves in Caribbean colonies that were harvesting the sugar at the end of a lash, of a whip. And so they brought considerable financial pressure to bear on those people and firms that were involved in the slave trade. So British women like Hannah More is one of them, were very prominent in this effort as well. So I hope you'll agree that this is truly a tribute to how you can change the world by changing ideas. And I hope we never forget what people like Hannah More and William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and John Newton, and so many others accomplished. when they set out on this seemingly unachievable long shot objective of ending the slave trade and then slavery itself. Well, with that, I think we have maybe 15 minutes or so for questions, and I would be happy to take some. If I'll watch for them in the Q&A window and take as many as I can. Thank you for being so attentive, and hopefully you'll pursue this topic through further readings at fee.org and elsewhere in the years to come. Well, I know sometimes it takes a little bit to break the ice for someone to submit the first question. Hannah, are you still there?
Yes, I am. We do have a few just rolling in right now.
Okay, as they roll in, why don't I help break that ice even further by just sharing a quote from Thomas Clarkson himself. I suggested that he was a man of character, and that was what helped to sustain him and make him so courageous. Here's something that he wrote in his diary 1 month after that important meeting around the print shop table with those 11 Quakers in May of 1787. This is June 27, 1787. He's telling of the moment that he arrived in the slave ship port of Bristol. He had genuine misgivings about his work. He didn't know, oh my gosh, what have I embarked upon? I put my career aside. Can we win this? Will I lose my life in the process? But that gave way to a steely determination that served him well in the battles ahead. And here's what he wrote in his diary as he approached the port of Bristol. He said, I began now to tremble for the first time at the arduous task I had undertaken of attempting to subvert one of the branches of the commerce of the great place which was then before me. I began to think of the host of people I should have to encounter in it. I anticipated much persecution in it also, and I questioned whether I should even get out of it alive. But in journeying on, I became more calm and composed. My spirits began to return. In these latter moments, I considered my first feelings as useful, inasmuch as they imposed upon me the necessity of extraordinary courage and activity and perseverance, and of watchfulness also over my own conduct, that I might not throw any stain upon the cause I had undertaken. In other words, he's saying, I've got to be a man of solid character if I want to be a person of influence. When therefore I entered the city, I entered it with an undaunted spirit, determining that no labor should make me shrink, nor danger, nor even persecution deter me from my pursuit. And that pretty much describes the next 50 years of the man's life. Okay, questions? Oh, I guess I had to click on Q&A, right? There they are. Thank you for the comment, anonymous attendee, that this information is truly inspiring. I had hoped it would be. Another person says, just want to thank you for telling such a wonderful story. You're very welcome. What parts of the world still have slavery is a question. Well, would you believe, I don't know if you've seen the recent movie Sound of Freedom, but it actually deals with a form of slavery that is occurring at our southern border. People who are being trafficked, young people, very young people in many cases, as sex slaves. And that's happening not so far away. There are parts of Africa where slavery is still taking place. And a lot of this depends on how much or how do you define it? Or when does simply living under a bad regime, when does it go from just a bad regime to full-blown slavery? But in, let me see, parts of Asia, it is still happening. And I don't know about the accuracy of this statement, but at the end of the movie, Sound of Freedom, when it's has some verbiage on the screen, it says that there are as many people today in the world enslaved as there were at the height of slavery 200 years ago, 200 some years ago. that to me is shocking and hard to believe. I haven't verified that, but there are those who make that claim, as is made at the end of that movie. But it's not so visible because it is technically illegal almost everywhere, but it still takes place.
And Larry, I actually have two questions for you.
Okay.
And the first one is, why is it that we see this movement in the UK before we see it in America? And what kind of circumstances in America did not allow this movement to happen as soon as it did in UK?
Oh, great question. Great. And I've pondered this myself many times. These are common questions that historians don't always give the same answer for, but here's mine. In Great Britain, there was a kind of religious revival underway that would catapult people of conscience to positions of influence and power. And you'll find that among the leadership of the early anti-slavery movement were very prominent people of faith. And they came to their anti-slavery conclusions by their reading of scripture. And they thought this slavery business is ugly, it's unbiblical, it's nasty. Human beings should not be doing this to their fellow humans. And that was a considerable influence over the start of the movement and its ultimate success. In America, we will see some of that a little later in the 1800s, but there were so many other factors that contributed to the matter not being settled the way it was in Britain. In Britain, as I mentioned, it was settled peaceably in the sense that they didn't have to fight a civil war over it. But that's in part because the British people didn't any longer have slavery in Britain anyway, whereas in America, half the country or a third of it anyway could actually see it down the street or in the fields next door. So it was more real to Americans. There were perhaps a greater number of Americans, mostly in the South, who benefited from it. But, every state in the Union in the United States had slavery at one point or another. It's just that the movement to end it began in the Northeast and got to the South last. And so a number of states in the Northeast abolished slavery themselves early in the 19th century. But, then we had sectional differences. We had the tariff issue and the rise of so many fire-breathing politicians who didn't want a peaceful solution. They were eager for conflict, and that didn't help things. And that only emblazoned or inflamed tensions and passions until the issue couldn't be settled anymore except by conflict. So we're one of the places in the world where slavery came to an end, not peaceably, but through conflict. I should point out too, in Britain, there was a parliamentary solution that made the ending of it possible, in part. The Brits adopted a compensated emancipation. By that, I mean, they said, okay, we're going to end slavery now, but we recognize that it was legal and a lot of people have invested a lot into it. So we're going to provide compensation at taxpayers' expense and effectively buy the freedom of slaves by paying off the slave owners. Now, you can argue whether that was a good idea or not. And you can also argue whether or not the compensation should more fairly have gone to the slaves, not to the slave owners. But it did, I think, help in bringing it to an end, because by that time, then almost everybody saw the wisdom of not fighting the anti-slavery movement any further. We can just end this now peaceably and with minimal cost to most people, but not, of course, to the slaves. So maybe that helps explain why it was settled here in America in a very different and much more violent way, unfortunately.
Thank you, Larry. I think we have two more questions in the chat before I ask another one.
Okay. Let's see. Why would people still need slavery? Well, nobody needs it. But some people promote it or are involved in it because, first of all, they surely lack any moral conscience. And secondarily, they've determined that it's a way for them, at other people's expense, to make money. The sex traffickers involved at our southern border and other places in the world, I mean, they're doing it because they're paid handsomely by the beneficiaries of this sex trafficking. There are cartels who make big money off of trafficking in human beings, just as they do in drugs. So nobody needs it. But there are some people who have decided to engage in it, who lack a moral conscience and decide they'd rather make money than do the right thing to their fellow men. Oh, is there another one I haven't answered? Yeah, maybe I have to scroll down a little bit. Okay, I have a question that just popped into my mind. Please pardon me if you already mentioned this before, but are the Quakers who make oatmeal the same as the Quaker religious group? Other than that, thank you for an informative story. I never knew who wrote Amazing Grace. They gave me shivers. Well, you know, the Quaker Oats, the company years ago did adopt the image of, I think it's supposed to be William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, who was himself a Quaker, as their mascot on their rolled oats cereal boxes. But I don't know that the folks at that company themselves were Quakers or are Quakers or have any direct connection. I would guess that they don't, that they simply adopted that image to convey. I mean, when you look at that image of William Penn smiling, you think of brotherhood, you think of kindness, you think of the great American colonist who believed in freedom, never owned a slave. You know, a lot of pretty uniformly good things you think of, and hopefully Quaker Oats will want you to think that you should buy their oats too. But I don't think there's otherwise a connection.
Then I have one more question for you, Larry.
Okay.
We see that at the height of European colonialism, that there are so many different countries involved from Europe in colonialism, whether that be in Africa or the New World or Asia, India, etc. Why is it that we mostly hear about American slavery today? Is that because we're in America and that's why I hear it? Or is it a certain type of narrative that's happened at some point?
Well, I think it's primarily the first, but the second matter has become an issue as well. But the fact is that slavery to Americans is rather personal. We all know that we had it, and we all know people who are here today because they're descendants of people who were victims of it. We know them by name. It's not some distant thing that happened somewhere else a long time ago. It happened here in the lifetimes of our great grandparents. So that's probably the reason, the main reason. But also it's taken on a political dimension too. I think this is very unfortunate, but there are people who traffic in the idea that America is not exceptional for the good it's done, it's exceptional for the evil, like slavery, that it engaged in. And therefore we should, government policy should be adopted to do fill in the blank, pay reparations, issue official apologies, like sort of thing. Which has made, unfortunately, a lot of Americans think that we're somehow unique in the history of slavery. If America is unique in the history of slavery, it's because it's not because we had slavery. Most of the world did. It's more because we fought a war to bring it to an end. That's quite remarkable that there was enough spirit in this country to free people who had been enslaved that people went to war over it. But keep in mind, it was so common. Did you know, for instance, that in the mid-19th century, at one point we had as many as 3,700 Black slave owners in America who owned themselves another 13,000 plus Black slaves. That many American Indian tribes Cherokees in particular had slaves, not just of Black people, but of other Indians. I mean, this is an age-old common institution, and it was practiced all over the world. For years after Britain ended slavery, its greatest effort to bring it to an end around the world was aimed at Arab countries because they were up to their eyeballs in slave traffic, kidnapping Africans and making them go to what is now Saudi Arabia, other Middle Eastern countries as slaves. So, well, I may have gotten a bit off track there, but I think it's close to us because it happened here, and which makes the British effort to end it all the more remarkable, because although Britons were making money off of it, the average Briton didn't see it next door, and yet they still signed up and said, let's get rid of this.
Thank you, Larry, for this wonderful lecture. Do you have any final remarks before we close for the night?
Well, I'll just say that I hope there's nothing that I've said that will depress anybody. Yeah, there have been painful, awful periods in the history of humankind, but there have been great moments too. And I've just told you about one where people, Black and white, came together and fought side by side to end an evil institution. And that's a great thing. We should celebrate that fact. We can do it again, whatever the cause may be, if we put our minds to it, because ideas, more than anything else, are what change the world. You change ideas, you can change the world.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.